December the 20th, 1943. The skies above northern Germany were burning. What began as a clear winter morning had turned into chaos. Flat clouds blossomed across the horizon. Engines roared. Bombers screamed through the smoke. Among them was a B-17 flying fortress named Year-Old Pub. It had taken off from Kimbolton, England, as part of the 379th Bomb Group. Its mission was to strike the Focke-Wulf aircraft factories near Bremen. It never made it home with the others. The German defences were waiting. Anti-aircraft guns tore into the formation, the sky filled with black bursts of steel. When the smoke cleared, the pub was alone. Its nose was shattered. One engine was dead. Another coughed smoke. The tail section was shredded, half the crew wounded. Oxygen masks froze solid. The radio was silent. Inside the cockpit, 21-year-old pilot Charlie Brown fought the controls with frozen hands. His co-pilot lay slumped beside him. His tail gunner was gone. The bomber groaned under its own weight, bleeding oil and fuel into the grey sky. They were still deep over enemy territory. Every second meant another mile closer to the North Sea, closer to home. But home was hundreds of miles away, and the Luftwaffe was already in the air. Far below, at a German airfield near Bremen, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 lifted off the runway. Its pilot was Franz Stigler, a 28-year-old ace of the Luftwaffe. He had already survived North Africa and Sicily, earning his place among Germany's finest. For him, this was supposed to be a routine interception, a chance to score another kill before the day's end. As Stigler climbed through the haze, he spotted something in the distance. A bomber, flying low, struggling to stay in the air. Its formation was gone. Its guns were silent. It was the easiest target he could imagine. He closed the distance, lining up the B-17 in his gun sight. One short burst would end it. But as the bomber filled his viewfinder, he hesitated. Through the cracked glass and torn fuselage, he could see the crew inside. Blood, smoke, movement, men still alive trying to keep their crippled machine flying. The tail gunner's position was destroyed. The dorsal turret hung motionless. The American pilot was staring straight ahead, unaware that death hovered behind him. Franz Stigler's finger rested on the trigger, and then a voice from his past returned to him, his old commander, Gustav Rödel. "Fight with honor. You shoot only when your enemy fights you. If I ever hear you kill a helpless man, I'll have you shot myself." The B-17 was no longer fighting. It was falling homeward, half dead. Stigler eased his finger off the trigger. He could not do it. Not like this. Instead of attacking, he pulled closer. Wingtip to wingtip, the German fighter rose alongside the American bomber. Inside, the crew could hardly believe their eyes. A German ace right next to them, matching their speed, his guns quiet. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Franz Stigler looked across the short distance between them and nodded. A simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of everything the war had forgotten: mercy, respect, humanity. The B-17 kept flying west toward the sea, and the German pilot, who could have destroyed it with a single burst, stayed by its side. In that frozen sky over Germany, one man chose not to kill, and in doing so, changed 2 lives forever. At dawn on December 20th, 1943, the airfield at Kimbolton was alive with engines. Frost clung to the wings of the flying fortresses lined up along the runway. Ground crews shouted over the roar of turbines. Pilots checked instruments. The mission board read one word that made every man tighten his jaw: Bremen. It was one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany, home to Focke-Wulf, Krupp and U-boat factories. Every gun between the North Sea and the Weser River was aimed at the sky. Inside the B-17 Ye-Old Pub, the crew went through the same ritual they'd practiced 12 times before. Pilot Charlie Brown, 21 years old, quiet but stubborn. Co-pilot Pinky Luke, calm under pressure. Navigator Al Sadok plotting their course toward the target, and 7 others, gunners, engineers and radio operators, each with their own private thoughts of home. The bomber lifted from the icy runway and climbed toward the clouds. At first it felt like routine. They formed up with hundreds of others, an iron armada stretching for miles, silver wings flashing in the pale sun. The radio crackled with coded chatter. Altitude, 25,000 feet. Air temperature, -40. Bremen lay 3 hours away. At the edge of the North Sea, the first bursts of flak appeared, black flowers blooming against the blue, At first they were distant, then they weren't. The sky filled with explosions. Every burst sounded like a sledgehammer against the fuselage. The airframe shook, rivets rattled, frost fell like snow inside the cabin. The formation tightened, bombers pressing wingtip to wingtip for protection. Through the cockpit window, Charlie Brown saw tracers streaking upward like comets. The Luftwaffe had arrived. Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs dove out of the sun, guns flashing. The formation dissolved into chaos. Engines caught fire, bombers rolled into the clouds trailing smoke and flame. Ye Old Pub stayed steady until the first shells hit. A burst tore through the nose, killing the bombardier instantly. Fragments of plexiglass and steel cut through the cockpit like knives. Brown felt something warm splash across his face. His co-pilot was hit. Another shell struck the No. 2 engine. It coughed, sputtered, and died. Hydraulics failed. Oxygen lines ruptured. In the tail, the gunner shouted through the intercom, "They're coming again!" Then the line went dead. The next attack came from above. A 20mm shell exploded near the dorsal turret, shredding the gunner's legs. The radio operator was thrown against the bulkhead unconscious. The tail section was half gone. Inside the bomber, the temperature dropped to below -50. Breathing felt like swallowing knives. Blood froze on the walls before it could drip to the floor. Brown gripped the controls with numb hands. The instruments were useless. The bomber had fallen out of formation, alone in the sky. Below them stretched the patchwork fields of northern Germany, silent and endless. Every village meant another gun battery, another line of tracers reaching upward. They dropped their bombs blindly, the payload tumbling through clouds toward Bremen's factories far below. Then they turned west, hoping to make it to the sea. But the Luftwaffe wasn't finished. 2 fighters appeared from the haze, closing fast. The nose gunner managed to fire a short burst before his guns jammed. One of the attackers broke off, the other kept coming. It lined up behind the B-17, ready to finish it off. Brown prepared for impact, but the attack never came. The German had seen enough damage to assume the bomber was doomed. He broke away, leaving the crippled fortress to fall on its own. Inside, the crew was silent. Half of them were bleeding. The engines rattled like dying hearts. Yet somehow the B-17 stayed in the air 1 mile, then 2, then 10. Over the radio there was only static. No escort, no formation, no hope. And then, out of the haze behind them, another shadow appeared. Another fighter, sleek, silver, and fast. This one didn't fire. It was simply watching. Charlie Brown thought his luck had run out. But what was approaching was not death. It was something far rarer mercy. Franz Stigler had been flying long before the war began. He was born in Regensburg, Germany, in 1915, the son of an airplane mechanic. As a boy, he watched his father work on biplanes, fascinated by the smell of oil and the gleam of metal under sunlight. He learned to fly gliders at 15, and by his 20s he was instructing others to do the same. Flying, to him, was not war. It was purity, precision, and peace. When the Second World War began, that purity was corrupted. The same sky he once loved became a battlefield. By 1943, Stigler was a combat veteran of the Luftwaffe. He had fought in North Africa under Hans-Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa, and survived countless dogfights. He had seen friends burn in their cockpits and enemies fall from the clouds like shattered birds. But even as the war hardened the men around him, something inside Stigler refused to die. His commander, Gustav Rödel, had drilled into him a code that was older than the war itself. Fight with honor. Never shoot a man who cannot defend himself. You are a pilot, not a murderer. That code had already saved lives. Once, after shooting down a British bomber, Stigler had spotted a parachute drifting down through the smoke. He circled it twice, making sure the pilot landed safely before returning to base. Some called him soft, others said he was old-fashioned. But to Stigler, mercy was not weakness. It was discipline. It was the last proof that war had not turned him into an animal. By late 1943, Germany's war effort was collapsing. The Allies were striking deeper and deeper into the heart of the Reich. Every week the sirens wailed, and the bombers came. Factories, shipyards, and cities burned. To Stigler, it felt as if the entire world was on fire, and he was standing in the middle of the blaze. On the morning of December 20th, he was stationed at an airfield near Bremen. He was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109 when the alert siren began to wail. Engines roared to life across the tarmac. Mechanics shouted. Pilots ran to their planes. Above them, the sky was already filled with black smoke trails, the aftermath of the American bombing raid. Dozens of bombers had crossed the city, and anti-aircraft guns were still firing into the clouds. Stigler climbed into his cockpit and started the engine. The familiar vibration ran through his bones. He checked his guns half empty from a previous sortie and throttled forward. As he climbed into the cold air, the war unfolded beneath him in miniature. Columns of smoke rose from the ruins of Bremen. The radio buzzed with frantic chatter, damaged bombers breaking formation, fighters running low on fuel, gunners calling out targets. Stigler scanned the horizon. Most of the bombers were already gone, heading northwest toward the North Sea. But then he saw it, a lone B-17, flying far below, barely holding altitude. No escort, no formation, just one crippled giant limping home. His first thought was professional instinct, an easy kill. He adjusted his heading, descended through the haze, and closed the distance. The markings on the tail were American. The plane's name, Ye Old Pub, was painted just behind the nose. As he approached from behind, he realized the bomber was riddled with holes. One engine was dead, another smoked. The tail section was shredded. He could see the gunner's position, empty and twisted like a crushed can. Through the cockpit glass, he caught a glimpse of movement men still alive inside, struggling to keep the bomber steady. One of them turned his head just enough for Stigler to see his face. He was young, barely more than a boy. Something in Stigler's chest tightened. This was not combat. This was execution. He thought of Rudel's words. He thought of the oath he had taken, not to a regime, but to the ancient brotherhood of pilots, the bond that said the sky belonged to all who dared to fly in it. He eased his finger off the trigger. He would not kill them, not like this. But in making that choice, he had already committed a crime. Mercy toward the enemy was treason in the eyes of the Reich. If anyone saw what he was about to do, he could be court-martialed, even executed. Still, Stigler pushed his throttle forward and climbed to meet the wounded bomber. Whatever happened next would define him for the rest of his life. The crippled B-17 limped westward, its engines coughing in protest. Inside the cockpit, Charlie Brown could barely keep his eyes open. His vision blurred from blood loss and exhaustion. The intercom was dead. The instruments flickered. Every vibration of the plane felt like the end. They had been hit over Bremen, flak tearing through the fuselage, enemy fighters swarming them like wolves. The nose gunner was dead. The radio operator was unconscious. The tail gunner's position was gone completely, ripped open by cannon fire. The oxygen lines were shredded, and frost coated the glass from the freezing air that poured inside. Charlie had managed to level the bomber barely, but now it was losing altitude. He didn't know how far they were from the sea, or if they'd even make it that far. He just kept flying west, toward what he hoped was home. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A flicker of sunlight on wings. A German fighter. His heart stopped. The crew who were still conscious looked out their shattered windows and saw it too. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 approaching fast from behind. This was it. After everything they'd survived, this would be the end. The fighter closed in and then slowed. It didn't fire. Instead, the sleek grey machine eased up alongside them, so close they could see the pilot's face. He wore a leather helmet, goggles, and a white scarf fluttering in the wind. He looked at them, studied the damage. His eyes moved across the bullet holes, the shattered turret. The wounded men slumped at their posts. Charlie gripped the yoke tighter. He waited for the flash of tracer rounds, but it never came. The German pilot raised his hand and nodded. A small, deliberate gesture. At first, Charlie didn't understand. Then the fighter slid even closer, almost touching wingtips, and began to signal with its movements. Left, right, up, motioning toward the west, toward the sea. It was as if he was saying, "Keep going, this way." "Go home?" Inside the bomber, disbelief turned to silence. No one spoke. No one dared. They just watched, as the man who should have been their executioner became their guardian. For 10 long minutes, the two aircraft flew side by side. The predator and the prey, united by something wordless. The B-17, bleeding oil and smoke. The Messerschmitt, its guns silent. When they reached the edge of the German coast, the fighter pilot turned his head one last time. He looked directly at Charlie Brown. and in that single glance something passed between them. Understanding, respect, humanity. Then Franz Stigler saluted. He pulled his plane upward, rolled once to the left, and disappeared into the clouds. Charlie watched him go, stunned. For a long time he just stared at the empty sky where the German had been. Then, with trembling hands, he turned his bomber toward England. No one spoke for the rest of the flight. Each man was lost in his thoughts of the battle, the loss, and the stranger who had spared their lives. When they finally crossed the English coast and landed, the B-17 looked more like a ghost than an aircraft. Bullet holes everywhere, half the crew wounded, the tail barely attached. The ground crew who saw it couldn't believe it had made it home. When debriefed, Charlie told the officers what had happened, how a German fighter had escorted them instead of shooting them down. But few believed him. To most it sounded impossible, an enemy ace showing mercy. Yet it had happened. High above a frozen battlefield, two young men from opposite sides of the world had chosen for a moment not to be enemies. When Ye Old Pub touched down in England, the airfield fell silent. Mechanics, medics and officers rushed toward it but stopped halfway staring. The bomber looked like it had been torn apart in the sky. More than 300 bullet holes. No tail gunner, no nose, no radio. And yet it had landed. Charlie Brown stepped out of the cockpit, dazed and pale, his uniform stiff with dried blood. He could barely stand. The medics helped him down, and as they carried him away, one officer asked what had happened. He told them everything, about the raid over Bremen, the flak, the fighters, and then about the German pilot who had appeared beside them and didn't fire. The officer frowned, scribbled a few notes and said quietly, "Don't tell anyone else about this. It might not be well received." Charlie understood. To the men fighting the war, mercy from the enemy wasn't part of the story. The public wanted heroes and victories, not tales of compassion from the other side. So he kept it to himself. The war went on. Charlie flew more missions. He was shot down again, captured, and spent the last months of the war as a prisoner in a German camp. When he finally returned home to West Virginia, the war was over. But the memory of that one encounter never left him. Years passed. The world changed. The men who had fought each other now lived among the ruins they once bombed. Charlie built a quiet life in America, working for the State Department. He married, raised children, and tried to move on. But sometimes, at night, he'd look at the sky and remember that grey fighter sliding beside him in the clouds. The face of the man who could have killed him, but didn't. He wondered if that man had survived, if he'd made it through the war, if he ever thought of the bomber he spared. For nearly 40 years he didn't know. On the other side of the Atlantic, Franz Stigler's life had changed too. After the encounter, he returned to base, silent, shaken, and deeply aware of the risk he'd taken. If anyone had seen what he'd done, he could have faced a firing squad. But no one asked questions. He survived the rest of the war, flying missions until Germany's final collapse. When it was over, he refused to fight anymore. He immigrated to Canada, seeking a quiet life far from the ruins of Europe. He became a businessman, building a new home and never speaking of what had happened in that frozen sky over Bremen. For him, the war was something to forget. Until, decades later, a letter arrived. In the late 1980s, Charlie Brown, now retired, decided he couldn't let the story die with him. He began writing to veteran associations, Luftwaffe groups and reunion networks, asking a single question. Does anyone know a pilot named Franz Stigler? He was flying a Bf-109 over Bremen, December 1943. For months there was no answer. Then one day a reply arrived, a letter from Canada. It was from Franz Stigler. He wrote, "I was the one. I saw your bomber that day. I could not shoot. I thought you might never have made it home." Charlie read the letter in silence, his hands trembling. After 46 years, he had finally found him. They arranged to meet. In June 1990, in a hotel room in Vancouver, the two men came face to face for the first time since that day in 1943. When they saw each other, neither spoke at first. They simply embraced. Two old men, once enemies, now brothers. Charlie said softly, "I owe you my life." Franz smiled. "No, my friend, I saved my honor." From that day on, they became inseparable. They visited each other often, called weekly, and spent hours talking about the war, not the battles or the medals, but the choices that defined them. They spoke at schools and veterans' gatherings, telling their story together. Not of enemies, but of humanity. When Franz Stigler died in 2008, Charlie Brown followed him just a few months later. Friends said it was as if they couldn't live without one another, and so, their story, born in blood and mercy, in one moment of impossible grace, came full circle. High above the clouds of war, one man's compassion had reached across nations, across hatred, across time itself, and in doing so proved something eternal. Even in war, humanity can survive.